Welcome back. You're watching The Globe here on SABC News Channel. I am Tshepiso Makwetla. Opposition parties in South Africa are gunning for Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana to rein in the debt to GDP level, as well as a spiraling debt service costs, which in excess of 100 billion rand a year stand at the moment. Presenting its alternative budget in Cape Town, the Democratic Alliance, the official opposition, has reiterated its call for the introduction of a basic income grant. President Cyril Ramaphosa has said government would be investigating the affordability of a basic income grant during his State of the Nation address. Now, anticipation is high for the budget speech scheduled for Wednesday as opposition parties weigh in on their expectations. The DA has presented its alternative budget. As we mentioned, the party says it's opposed to any tax increases and wants debt levels curbed. Opposition parties also want clear plans to stimulate the economy and create jobs. There's consensus that state-owned entities should no longer be bailed out. The basic income grant debate is likely to take center stage. Well, let's see what the pundits are saying as the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana puts on the final touches to that maiden budget speech. Some economists expect the minister to maintain most of the current tax regime, this on the back of the economy and fiscus that is recovering from the effects of COVID-19, as we mentioned. The improvement in revenue driven by commodities and the lowering of lockdown regulations to level 1 could also give consumers a relief from higher taxes. For all of this and more, we're joined now by Nedbank's senior economist Isaac Matshego. Isaac, such a pleasure to talk to you. So let's just start from what you and your team have, are working against in terms of the macroeconomic environment. What are we looking at?
Well, the minister is going to present the budget against a very favorable backdrop. We had a very strong recovery in 2021, and that has boosted tax collections. I mean, we just saw the SARS numbers up to December last year, and there were some very strong increases in, for instance, corporate taxes. We also saw personal tax payments being high, and also VAT collections. So it's a positive story from a macroeconomic viewpoint, but of course, the boost from the very favorable global conditions is going to dissipate, particularly into the second half of this year.
All right. So, Isaac, perhaps let me just remain with taxes. At the moment, I believe that's at 17.8% compared to 2019. But you do expect collections to ease by 5.8% in the 2022-2023 period. Why?
Sure, definitely. I mean, if I just have to talk about tax collections for the current fiscal year, which ends on the 31st of March, we expect government to collect about 215 billion, more than what it had estimated at the time of the budget speech last year. And that will be about 87 billion, more than what the minister estimated in November last year. But we have to put it in perspective. This massive windfall comes after the sharp drops that we saw in 2020 when the economy was hit by the full effect of COVID. I mean, in that year, at least the fiscal year, revenue was down almost 102 billion and expenditure was up almost 128 billion. So this number basically is sort of smoothing the effects of COVID.
But corporate tax remains unchanged at 28%. Why is that? And are we anticipating some adjustments in terms of the tax brackets and rebates?
On the corporate tax front, you'll remember that about 2 years ago, Minister Mboweni hinted that National Treasury would be moving towards cutting the corporate tax rate from 28%. But we do believe that the current environment sort of is still jittery, and also measures that were supposed to be introduced back then to really help to broaden the tax base were delayed due to the effects of COVID. So we believe that we're not going to see the reduction of the corporate tax rate in this budget. Looking at the personal taxes, we expect the usual adjustment of the tax brackets. Hopefully those will match the inflation rate in order to avoid what is technically called bracket creep. But there'll be very limited relief for personal taxpayers.
I mean, coming off COVID-19 and the continual calls for taxing the rich more and to obviously be very vigilant for those who hide their money offshore. Just looking at the inequalities, particularly we saw the public sector wage talks highlight what workers are saying is this continuing spiral of, do you expect the debt service costs to pose a risk to expenditure ceiling targets, particularly with this in mind? I know that there is a court case still in the offing, but there's social transfers and just general elevated debt service costs.
Well, I'll say when it comes to taxes, we have to be quite careful about hiking taxes further for the high income earners, because they do account for most of the taxes collected. I mean, people with taxable incomes of more than 500,000 a year contribute a chunk of the personal taxes in South Africa. So we really have to be careful about continuing to squeeze them, because if as a country we keep doing that, those people will find ways of avoiding taxes. SARS has got to deal with those who evade tax or basically break the law not to pay taxes, but we've got to be considerate when it comes to the high income earners. Debt service costs are quite significant. They absorb a huge chunk of national revenue. Our debt level is quite high, and government now pays almost 230 billion a year just paying interest on the existing debt. Hence, we keep stressing that it's quite important for National Treasury to reduce its budget deficit, which is basically the shortfall between what it collects in taxes and spending plans, and a lower budget deficit will help to keep a lead on the increase in the debt stock, and in that way debt service costs will also increase at a slower rate. Ideally, we've got to reduce our debt level in South Africa. It's very high at around 70%.
But the public sector wage bill, that's a major item. What are the estimations if government has to make some sort of adjustment and appease the labor sector?
The outlook for the public sector wage bill is the big unknown right now, because we still don't have the final settlement between the government and the public sector unions. You'll recall that last year the increases were kept very low, that 1.5% increase cash transfers, adding about 20.5 billion to the public sector wage bill. And of course, there's still that issue of the 0% increases in 2020 that is still subject to a constitutional court judgment. That would add another 37 billion or so. It's quite important to ensure that we keep the public sector wage bill under control, at least the growth of the the public sector wage bill, because we've got to look at it, on a longer term basis. For the decade up to about 2019, that wage bill increased at an average rate of around 7% a year. And that was quite high when, for instance, private sector wage increases were between 3% and 5%. So there were very high increases in the public sector, and as a result, we've seen the wage bill absorbing more and more of fiscal revenue and actually crowding out other expenditure needs such as investment spending. So it is quite important to ensure that the productivity of the public sector workers is boosted and the pay is in line with that change in productivity.
I mean, on the one hand, Isaac, I'd imagine that government wants to ensure that at least consumer spending is boosted. So on the one hand, if the breadwinners are in the public sector, you would want to shore that up. But where do you take away money from if you're also focusing on boosting or continuing its social grants, which I think you say that will be anything up to 42 billion rand in the next financial year if government is, as anticipated by the midterm budget speech, that those will be higher?
So, the budget has got to be counter-cyclical. Which simply means that when the overall economy is under pressure, government has to adopt measures to help the economy to recover. We saw that, for instance, happening back in 2009 when our economy contracted by 1.5% due to the effects of the global financial crisis. But unfortunately, since then, we saw the local growth rate weakening due to an absence of measures to boost growth. And it's quite imperative right now that government accelerate those measures to boost economic growth. It's also very encouraging that, for instance, in the State of the Nation address, both this year and last year, we got from the President announcements that we believe will go a long way towards helping to revive economic growth. So we've got to sort of adopt this big bang approach of ensuring that, we revive the economy, whilst on the other hand, we're helping the consumers, at least those who cannot really take care of themselves right now. But the long-term goal should be to ensure that we create jobs, because it's only through job creation that incomes will be generated, and higher incomes help to reduce poverty and they help to reduce inequality.
All right, so if I could just ask you to respond to this very briefly, because I still want us to talk about SOEs. In that vein, there is a debate around the, basic income grant. There are those who are opposed to it who are saying that that would actually deter employers from hiring people because labor will be expensive. And there are those who say if you just look at by how much is being increased, it'll barely make a dent in a high inflationary environment like we're in at the moment.
The basic income grant will be quite important, but it has got to be a temporary measure. What really has to happen is create an environment that will help to attract investment, both from international investors and also domestic investors. And that was the President's message in the State of the Nation address. We agree with that fully.
All right, so SOEs, does government have the appetite to make the financial transfers that some of these may need? And I have in mind Eskom. You can't grow the economy with an Eskom in the state that it's in, but do we have money in the fiscus to continue bailing out Eskom and other SOEs?
In the medium-term budget policy statement in November last year, Minister Godongwana made it quite clear that government has got no appetite for whole-scale bailouts as we got accustomed to over the past few years. So it's encouraging that National Treasury will restrict the bailouts to the state-owned enterprises, but we will concede that some key institutions or enterprises such as Eskom continue to need that financial assistance. What is encouraging is that, for instance, in the energy sector, we are seeing the acceleration of reform measures that are going to help to expand energy generation. And as a result of that, we do expect that Eskom in future will be less of a burden on the economy than it is right now.
And you're saying, just in light of all of these considerations, government has to focus on, among other things, spending on infrastructure. And I'd like to look at the transport sector, particularly the rail industry is being pointed to as having the potential of helping government, make some of these increases in revenue. Your thoughts, how and when?
Sure, we need to revive the rail system in South Africa and actually modernize it, and that will help to, for instance, facilitate the flow of goods in and outside the country, into the country rather. And in the SONA, you will remember that the president indicated that by the end of this year, Transnet would have finalized legislation to allow private operators to operate on its network, and that will go some way, I believe, in attracting investment in our transport sector, particularly rail, because the message here is that we've got to get goods off the road, which is more expensive, and get them onto trains.
Isaac, thank you so much as always for your time and your insight. Isaac Matshego is a senior economist there at Nedbank. He is speaking in light of the budget speech that is expected here in South Africa on Wednesday. Right, we're going to take